Is there anything more haunting than discovering that one's own blood carries a curse? Marcus Thompson believed a simple journey could cure him of his recurring nightmares, the episodes of uncontrollable rage that had been intensifying in recent months. At 33, this ordinary-looking man was hiding a secret that not even he fully understood. The sleepless nights, the unexplained scratches on his body, the torn clothes found in the garden one morning, all these seemed symptoms of some mental disorder he hoped to overcome through familial love. The idea for the trip came during a conversation with his wife, Sarah, a determined woman who saw signs of severe depression in her husband. She couldn't explain Marcus's behavioral changes, but she sensed he needed to reconnect with something essential in his life. Their children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler, also noticed that Dad was acting different, more distant, sometimes even frightening when he stared into space during dinner. Sarah suggested they visit the family cabin in rural Oregon, a place where Marcus had spent happy summers as a child. Marcus initially resisted the idea, claiming he didn't feel well enough to travel. Something inside him whispered warnings, a primal voice warning him of the dangers of straying from the safety of home. But Sarah insisted, arguing that he needed fresh air, nature, and quality time with his family. She couldn't imagine she was suggesting the exact opposite of what Marcus needed. The waxing moon was approaching, and with it, a transformation he hadn't yet learned to fully control. The preparation for the trip was marked by an inexplicable tension. Marcus felt his muscles contracting involuntarily, his skin tingling as if something were moving beneath the surface. The smells seemed more intense. Sarah's perfume, the children's soap, even the scent of the new car purchased for the trip. All of this deeply disturbed him, creating a feeling of claustrophobia he had never experienced before. His senses were sharpening in a disturbing way, picking up sounds others couldn't hear, detecting movement in the periphery of his vision. Sarah organized everything with her usual efficiency, packing clothes, games for the children, and supplies for a few days in the secluded cabin. Marcus watched the preparations with growing anxiety, feeling that each item packed brought them closer to something terrible. He tried to argue that perhaps they should postpone the trip, making excuses about work commitments, but Sarah wouldn't have it. She was determined to save her marriage and genuinely believed that this trip would be the first step toward her husband's recovery. The day before his departure, Marcus had his most vivid dream yet. He saw himself running through a dense forest, his bare feet treading on damp leaves and broken branches. But these weren't human feet. They were paws covered in thick, dark fur. In the dream, he could taste blood in his mouth, the savage pleasure of the hunt, the adrenaline rush of stalking terrified prey. He woke with a muffled scream, his pillow soaked with sweat, his nails visibly grown overnight. Sarah woke to her husband's sudden movement, worried about his condition. Marcus tried to reassure her, telling her it was just a nightmare, but she could see the genuine terror in his eyes. He seemed different this morning, more alert, almost animal-like in his movements. When she suggested canceling the trip due to his condition, Marcus surprisingly agreed to leave. Something had changed during that dream, as if a part of him had accepted the inevitable. The family set off early in the morning, with the sun still low on the horizon. Marcus drove with unnatural concentration, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. The children sang in the back seat, oblivious to the tension in the air. Sarah tried to keep the conversation light, commenting on the passing landscape, but she sensed something fundamental had changed in Marcus. He responded in monosyllables, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if he was seeing something she couldn't. The road snaked through the Oregon mountains like a pale scar cutting through the dark forest. Marcus felt every curve amplified, as if his body was synchronized with the vehicle's movement. His senses continued to heighten in disturbing ways. He could hear conversations in cars passing in the opposite direction, distinguish the individual sense of each family member, feel the engine's vibrations through the steering wheel as if they were extensions of his own nerves. Sarah noticed he was driving strangely, more aggressively than usual, passing other vehicles with an impulsiveness uncharacteristic of his cautious personality. The children began to grow restless after a few hours of driving. Emma complained of thirst, while Tyler asked to stop at a restroom. Sarah suggested they find a gas station, but Marcus insisted on driving on. Something inside him urged him to speed, as if a primal force was gradually taking control of his decisions. He muttered to himself that they needed to get to the cabin before dark, though he couldn't rationally explain this growing urgency that consumed him. The surrounding landscape became increasingly wild and isolated. The scattered houses gave way to endless expanses of ancient pine trees, their canopies forming a dark green canopy that partially blocked the sunlight. Marcus realized he could see details in the forest that would normally go unnoticed. Small animals moving among the trees, birds flying at considerable distances. Even the textures of the bark seemed sharper and more defined. This hyper-perception simultaneously fascinated and terrified him. Sarah tried to break the growing silence by telling stories about childhood vacations at the cabin. She mentioned how Marcus had always been adventurous as a child, exploring trails and playing in the woods late into the night. Ironically, these memories triggered disturbing flashbacks in his mind. He began to recall strange episodes from his youth, waking up in the middle of the woods with no idea how he got there, finding torn clothes, suffering unexplained injuries. These fragments of memory, previously dismissed as childish mischief, now took on a much more sinister and menacing meaning. The first real sign that something was terribly wrong came when they passed a flock of sheep grazing on a rural property. Marcus felt a ravenous primal hunger, an almost irresistible urge to stop the car and run toward the animals. His muscles contracted involuntarily, his pupils dilated, and for a terrifying moment, he nearly lost control of the steering wheel. Sarah screamed as the car swerved slightly off the road, but Marcus managed to regain control at the last second. He pulled over to the side of the road, shaking violently. Sarah asked him what was wrong, if he felt sick. Marcus couldn't explain the overwhelming sensation that had overcome him. It was as if another being had tried to take control of his body for a few terrifying seconds. The children sat silently in the back seat, intuitively sensing that something wasn't right with their father. Emma held her younger brother's hand, her wide, worried eyes observing the strange behavior of the adult who had always been their source of security. After a few minutes of standing on the shoulder, Marcus managed to partially regain his composure. He made up an excuse about dizziness and fatigue, suggesting that perhaps they should stop for lunch in a nearby town. Sarah immediately agreed, concerned for her husband's condition and relieved that he finally admitted he needed a break. They found a small family-run restaurant in a mountain town, a simple establishment frequented mainly by locals and passing truckers. During lunch, Marcus could barely concentrate on the food. Every odor in the restaurant bombarded him simultaneously. Fried grease, various perfumes, human sweat, cleaning products. Even more disturbing was his newfound ability to distinguish the individual scent of each person in the room. He could identify who was nervous, who had been drinking alcohol, even detect emotional nuances through smell. A waitress who approached his table carried a scent of fear that he could clearly detect, even though she maintained a professional smile. Sarah noticed that Marcus barely touched his food, pushing it around his plate while staring intently at the other diners. She tried to start a conversation about their plans for the next few days at the cabin, but he responded distractedly, as if his attention was constantly divided between his family and something invisible only he could perceive. The children ate in silence, picking up on the adults' tension and reacting with their natural instinct to become less visible when they sensed danger. A minor incident during lunch revealed just how much Marcus was changing. A man at the next table made a loud, rude comment about Sarah's appearance, something that would normally have resulted in a polite but firm response from her husband. This time, Marcus stood abruptly, his eyes flashing with a primal rage that startled even him. His posture changed instantly, shoulders tense, head tilted slightly forward, muscles braced for attack. The man visibly recoiled at the intensity of this unexpected reaction. Sarah quickly intervened, touching her husband's arm and suggesting they leave. Marcus allowed himself to be led out of the restaurant, but something had awakened within him during that moment of rage. He could feel strength coursing through his muscles, his senses becoming even more acute, a predatory confidence he had never experienced before. It was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying to feel this power growing within him, especially since he had no idea how to properly control it. Back in the car, the family atmosphere had become decidedly tense. Sarah asked questions about Marcus's behavior, concerned about the changes she'd noticed not only during the trip, but in recent weeks. She mentioned the constant nightmares, the episodes of anger, the way he sometimes looked at her as if he didn't fully recognize her. Marcus tried to downplay her concerns, but deep down, he knew she was right to be frightened. The children sat quietly in the back seat, occasionally whispering to each other. Emma, being older, was beginning to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with her father. She noticed how he constantly sniffed the air, how his eyes moved differently, how his muscles seemed always tense like an animal ready to pounce. Tyler, younger, simply felt the fear without understanding its origin, clinging to his favorite toy as if it were a protective talisman against forces his childish mind couldn't name. The afternoon wore on as they resumed their journey, and Marcus realized that each kilometer took them deeper into wilderness. The road had become narrower and more winding, lined with centuries-old pines that almost completely blocked the sunlight. His hearing had heightened to the point where he could hear small animals moving in the dense forest, the flight of birds hundreds of meters away, even the distant sound of a stream running between the rocks. These sounds created a natural symphony that simultaneously calmed and excited him in a disturbing way. Sarah tried to maintain a normal conversation, commenting on the beauty of the landscape and reminding Marcus of details about the cabin they hadn't visited in years. She mentioned how good it would be for the children to experience country life for a few days, away from technology and the hustle and bustle of the city. Marcus nodded mechanically, but his mind was fragmenting between the familiar human personality and something more primal that grew in strength and influence with each passing moment. The first visible physical sign of the transformation appeared when Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror to check on the children. Sarah noticed that his eyes looked different, not just the color, which seemed more intense, but also the way he focused, as if he were seeing through layers she couldn't perceive. His pupils dilated and contracted regardless of the light, reacting to stimuli that remained invisible to the rest of the family. When she commented on this, Marcus quickly looked away, instinctively knowing something was changing in his appearance. The hunger that had attacked him at the restaurant returned with a vengeance. But it wasn't hunger for human food. It was something more visceral and primal. As they passed a farm where horses grazed freely, Marcus felt his muscles contract involuntarily, an almost irresistible urge to stop and run toward the animals. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, fighting impulses his conscious mind recognized as profoundly abnormal and dangerous. Sarah sensed the growing tension and suggested they stop again, perhaps find a hotel in the next town instead of continuing on to the isolated cabin. Something in her maternal instincts warned her of impending danger, though she couldn't pinpoint its precise nature or origin. Marcus rejected the suggestion with surprising vehemence, insisting they needed to reach their original destination before nightfall. He couldn't explain this urgency even to himself, but he sensed that being in open, isolated space would be crucial to what was about to happen. The children began to show signs of real stress. Emma complained of a headache, while Tyler cried softly for no apparent reason. Sarah attributed their behavior to travel fatigue, but Marcus suspected it was something deeper. Perhaps they were unconsciously picking up on the changes occurring in him, responding to pheromones or subliminal signals that indicated a nearby predator. The idea that his own children might be unconsciously afraid of him was simultaneously devastating and strangely satisfying. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky with orange and red hues, Marcus felt a more intense transformation begin. His muscles began to pulse rhythmically, his skin tingling as if thousands of tiny needles were piercing it simultaneously. The scent of the forest became intoxicating, beckoning him to the wild freedom that awaited among the ancient trees. Sarah watched her husband with growing alarm, realizing that something fundamental was happening, something that transcended any conventional medical or psychological explanation. The crescent moon appeared on the horizon just as the family reached the dirt road leading to the secluded cabin. Marcus felt a visceral connection to the silvery satellite, as if invisible strings connected his body to that ancient light. His hands trembled uncontrollably on the steering wheel, not from nervousness, but from a primal energy demanding immediate release. The skin on his arms began to show small patches of dark hair that visibly grew, something he tried to hide by constantly adjusting the sleeves of his orange shirt. Sarah finally voiced her growing fears, asking directly if Marcus was using some kind of drug or had developed a serious medical condition. She mentioned how he constantly sniffed the air, how his movements had become more animalistic, how even his breathing sounded different, deeper, more rhythmic, almost as if he were constantly sniffing. Marcus tried to reassure her, but his own voice sounded strange, huskier, with a guttural tone he didn't recognize as his own. The dirt road wound through the dense forest for nearly 6 miles, each jolt of the vehicle intensifying Marcus's feeling that he was literally being shaken out of his human skin. The children had completely stopped talking, Emma hugging Tyler protectively as they both watched their father with wide, frightened eyes. They could sense something was fundamentally wrong, even without comprehending the supernatural nature of the transformation they were witnessing. When the cabin finally appeared in the clearing, surrounded by towering pines that stood like silent sentinels, Marcus stopped the car abruptly. He needed to get out of the vehicle immediately. The confined space had become unbearable, like a prison squeezing something too wild to contain. Sarah asked why he didn't drive to the cabin's entrance, but Marcus had already opened the door and jumped out, breathing deeply of the night air, thick with forest scents that overwhelmed his heightened senses. The transformation accelerated dramatically under the direct influence of the waxing moon. Marcus could feel his bones subtly lengthening, his muscles expanding, his hearing picking up the sounds of small animals from miles away. Even more disturbing was the shift in his thinking. The civilized personality he had known all his life was gradually being overtaken by predatory instincts that demanded hunting, territory, and dominance. Sarah and the children cautiously got out of the car, realizing that something profoundly abnormal was happening to the father and husband they loved. Marcus tried to carry the luggage into the cabin, but his hands had begun to change. His fingers lengthened, his nails visibly growing, his strength increasing alarmingly. When he lifted a heavy suitcase that would normally require considerable effort, it felt light as a feather. Sarah watched this display of unnatural strength with growing terror, realizing she was witnessing something that completely challenged her understanding of the natural world. The cabin's interior felt too claustrophobic to contain what Marcus was becoming. He paced nervously around the small space, sniffing constantly, his movements becoming increasingly fluid and predatory. Sarah tried to establish a normal routine, getting the children ready for bed. But she realized the situation had gone beyond any possibility of normalcy. Emma whispered to her mother that Daddy smelled different, like a wild animal she'd once encountered at the zoo. As the night deepened and the moon shone brighter through the cabin's windows, Marcus knew he could no longer fight the transformation. Something primal and powerful had awakened in his blood, something that demanded release into the wild expanse of the forest that stretched endlessly around the small human structure lost in the natural immensity. The complete transformation began after midnight, when the crescent moon reached its highest point in the starry sky. Marcus locked himself in the cabin's bathroom, desperately trying to contain what was happening to his body. His muscles contracted and expanded rhythmically, his skin stretched to accommodate a fundamentally changing body structure. The mirror reflected a creature that retained recognizable human features, dark hair slicked back, eyes that still held vestiges of its original personality, but mixed with wolfish aspects that relentlessly emerged. Sarah knocked on the bathroom door, concerned about the strange sounds she heard from inside. Low moans, scratching on the wood, heavy breathing that sounded more like muffled growls. Marcus tried to reply that he was fine, but his voice had completely changed, becoming a guttural sound that frightened her deeply. His clothes began to tear as his torso expanded, the orange shirt tearing apart to reveal muscles that pulsed with unearthly power. His nose and mouth partially elongated into a snout, while sharp fangs emerged from his aching gums. The children awoke to disturbing sounds coming from the bathroom. Emma tried to protect Tyler, taking him to the farthest room in the cabin, but they could both clearly hear the animalistic noises their father was making. Sarah remained outside the locked door, torn between her desire to help her husband and her growing instinct to protect her children from a threat she couldn't yet fully comprehend. She considered calling 911, but the cabin was in an area with no cell phone coverage, isolated from any form of communication with the outside world. When Marcus finally emerged from the bathroom, he had transformed into something halfway between man and beast. His human skin was covered in patches of thick, dark fur. His hands had elongated into sharp claws, but his eyes still held traces of humanity, pain, confusion, and a deep terror at what he had become. His orange shirt hung in tatters from his muscular torso, and he growled involuntarily as he struggled to maintain some control over the predatory instincts that dominated his thoughts. Sarah instinctively recoiled when she saw the creature her husband had transformed into. All the gradual changes she had observed during the trip now made terrible sense. He was literally becoming a monster before her eyes. Marcus tried to communicate that he was still himself, that he was fighting for control, but the words came out as low, menacing growls. Part of him still desperately loved his family, while another part saw his wife and children as potential prey that awakened a primal, uncontrollable hunger. The children remained hidden in the room, Emma holding Tyler as they both wept silently. They could hear their mother trying to speak to the creature that had been their father, her trembling voice a mixture of love and utter terror. Marcus slowly approached Sarah, one claw raised in a gesture that could have been protective or threatening, the other hand pressed against his chest as if trying to contain something wild that wanted to fully emerge. The moon continued to shine through the cabin windows as Marcus finally lost the final battle against his transformed nature. He looked at Sarah one last time with eyes that still held fragments of humanity, then turned and ran into the forest. His bare feet pounded the cabin floor before disappearing into the darkness among the ancient trees. Sarah stood in the open doorway, watching the creature that had been her husband dissolve into the vast wilderness, unsure if he would return as a man or a monster, or if he would ever return at all.